You destroyed everything! My dad Lawrence screamed, his face red with rage, as he slammed the IRS audit notice on the kitchen table. The papers scattered across the worn wood surface like accusations. 7 years, Melody. 7 years of fighting this mess because you couldn't handle simple bookkeeping. I sat there, stunned, watching my father's anger burn through our Seattle home like wildfire. My sister Cordelia stood beside him, her arms crossed, shaking her head in that disappointed way that had become all too familiar. The Christmas decorations still hung from last week's gathering, but the festive atmosphere had long since died. My name is Melody Harrison, and I'm 35 years old. For the past 7 years, I've been living under the crushing weight of a mistake that allegedly destroyed my family's accounting firm, Harrison & Associates. Every family dinner, every holiday, every phone call has been a reminder of how I supposedly ruined everything we'd built together. Dad, I've told you 1,000 times, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I followed the procedures exactly like you taught me. I don't understand how those entries got changed. Don't lie to me. Lawrence's voice cracked with emotion. The IRS found deliberate alterations in the books. Someone changed those numbers, and you were the only one with access to that software. Cordelia stepped forward, her expression a perfect mixture of disappointment and pity. Melody, we've been over this. The audit trail shows your login credentials, your computer, your changes. She pulled out a folder thick with documents. Maybe if you just admitted what happened, we could finally move forward as a family. But I hadn't done anything wrong. I knew I hadn't. Yet here I was, 7 years later, still trying to prove my innocence to the two people who should have believed me the most. The audit had found discrepancies totaling nearly $200,000 in client accounts, and somehow every finger pointed back to me. I've paid back every penny of those penalties, I said, feeling tears sting my eyes. I've covered the legal fees, the settlements, everything. What more do you want from me? Lawrence's expression softened slightly, but the disappointment remained. I want my daughter back. The one who cared about this family enough to tell the truth. As I looked around the room where I'd grown up, where we'd celebrated every achievement and milestone, I felt a familiar ache in my chest. The walls were covered with photos of our family's success. Lawrence receiving business awards, Cordelia graduating summa cum laude from her accounting program, and me, conspicuously absent from the more recent pictures. Something felt wrong about this whole situation, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Growing up, I'd always been the reliable one. While Cordelia charmed everyone with her perfect grades and social connections, I was the daughter who stayed late to help Lawrence organize client files and learn the business from the ground up. I genuinely loved the work, the precision of numbers, the satisfaction of balancing books perfectly, the trust clients placed in our family firm. Cordelia, 2 years younger, had always been Lawrence's favorite. She was beautiful, brilliant, and had a way of making everyone in a room focus on her. When she graduated with her accounting degree, Lawrence practically glowed with pride. Now we can really expand the business, he'd said. Having both my daughters working alongside me is everything I ever dreamed of. But even back then, I noticed things. Cordelia would come in late, leave early, and somehow always managed to avoid the tedious reconciliation work that kept our books accurate. She preferred meeting with high-profile clients and attending networking events, leaving me to handle the detailed financial work that actually kept the business running. She's building relationships, Lawrence would say whenever I mentioned the uneven workload. That's just as important as the day-to-day operations. I never minded. I was proud of my skills and trusted that my contributions were valued, even if they weren't as visible as Cordelia's networking successes. I had my own apartment in Capitol Hill, a small but comfortable place where I could decompress after long days at the office. The changes started gradually in the months before the audit. Cordelia began staying later, often working alone in the office after everyone else had gone home. She volunteered to handle more of the software updates and system maintenance, tasks she'd always avoided before. "I want to be more involved in the technical side," she explained when Lawrence praised her newfound dedication. "Melody's taught me so much about how everything works." I remember feeling pleased that she was finally taking more interest in the crucial back-end operations. We even had some good conversations about accounting procedures and client management during those weeks. She asked detailed questions about our software systems and seemed genuinely interested in learning how everything connected. Looking back now, I realized she was asking about security protocols, backup procedures, and audit trails. At the time, I thought she was just being thorough. I was happy to share my knowledge with my sister. The audit notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. Lawrence opened it during our weekly staff meeting, and I watched his face drain of color as he read the formal language about discrepancies requiring immediate investigation. "They're looking at our books from the past 2 years," he said quietly. "They want everything. Every transaction, every adjustment, every piece of documentation." I felt confident. Our books were meticulous. I double-checked every entry, maintained perfect records, and followed every procedure to the letter. I even welcomed the audit as a chance to prove how well-run our business was. How naive I was. The IRS investigators arrived 3 weeks later, and my world began to crumble. They set up in our conference room with boxes of documents and laptops, methodically going through every transaction with the intensity of surgeons examining a patient. I cooperated fully, walking them through our procedures and explaining our filing systems. Agent Patricia Williams seemed particularly interested in our software logs and user access records. She was thorough but professional, asking detailed questions about who had access to what systems and when. "Miss Harrison," Agent Williams said during my interview, "we found several entries that were modified after the initial posting. Can you explain why these changes were made?" I stared at the printouts she handed me. The numbers were wrong, completely different from what I remembered entering. Client payments had been moved between accounts, expense categories had been changed, and there were adjustments I'd never made. "I don't understand," I said, studying the documents. "These aren't the entries I made. Someone must have changed them after I input the original data." Agent Williams nodded, making notes. "According to our computer forensics team, these changes were made using your login credentials from your workstation. Can you explain how that might have happened?" My stomach dropped. I always log out when I leave my desk. I never share my password with anyone. The timestamp shows these changes were made at 11:47 p.m. on February 14th. Were you in the office that night? February 14th, Valentine's Day. I'd been home that evening, having dinner with my college friend Patricia at a restaurant downtown. I had the receipt in my purse, the credit card statement, even photos we'd taken at the restaurant. "No, I was out that evening. I can prove it." I showed her the evidence, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. Someone else must have used my login somehow. But Agent Williams' expression remained neutral. "We'll need to investigate further. In the meantime, we'll need you to step away from any financial responsibilities until this is resolved." The investigation dragged on for months. Every week brought new questions, new accusations, new evidence that seemed to point directly at me. The computer logs showed my credentials, my workstation, my access codes. The financial discrepancies totaled $197,000 across multiple client accounts. Lawrence grew more distant with each revelation. "How is this possible, Melody?" he asked during one particularly painful family dinner. "If you didn't make these changes, then who did?" Cordelia was supportive during those early days, often staying after our family meetings to offer comfort. "I know you didn't do this intentionally," she'd say. "Maybe you were just overwhelmed and made some errors. Dad will understand eventually." But I knew I hadn't made any errors. I'd been meticulous, careful, and professional. Someone had deliberately altered our books, and that someone had done it using my access. The question that haunted me as the investigation continued was simple. Who else could have had access to my login credentials? I was about to discover that the answer was closer to home than I ever imagined. The final audit report arrived on a gray October morning, and it shattered what remained of my relationship with my family. The investigators had concluded that the alterations were deliberate, sophisticated, and designed to hide missing funds. The penalties alone would cost the business nearly $300,000, not including legal fees and the damage to our reputation. Lawrence called an emergency family meeting that evening. I walked into his home office feeling like I was approaching my own execution. The room smelled of old leather and disappointment, the same space where he'd taught me about business ethics and family loyalty years before. "The final report confirms it," Lawrence said without looking up from the paperwork. "Deliberate manipulation of client accounts. Funds moved between accounts to hide shortfalls. The pattern shows planning and intent." Cordelia sat in the chair across from his desk, her face a mask of carefully controlled emotion. "What does this mean for the business?" she asked quietly. "We'll survive, but barely. The penalties will wipe out most of our reserves. Some clients are already talking about leaving." Lawrence finally looked at me, and I saw something die in his eyes. "Melody, I need to know. Did you take money from client accounts?" The accusation hit me like a physical blow. "Dad, I would never steal from our clients. You know me better than that." "I thought I did." His voice was barely a whisper, but the evidence doesn't lie. The computer logs, the timing, the sophistication of the alterations, it all points to someone with your level of access and knowledge. Cordelia reached across the desk and touched Lawrence's hand gently. "Dad, maybe we should consider that this was a cry for help. Melody's been under a lot of stress lately." I stared at my sister in disbelief. "A cry for help? Cordelia, I didn't do this." "The evidence says otherwise," Lawrence said firmly. "And until you're willing to take responsibility for what you've done, I can't have you involved in the business." That night, he read me out of his will. My inheritance, which would have been my share of the family business, was revoked. "Actions have consequences," he said as he signed the papers. "When you're ready to tell the truth, we can talk about rebuilding trust." Over the following months, the financial pressure became crushing. The business couldn't afford to pay the penalties, so I voluntarily took on the debt. I refinanced my apartment, took out personal loans, and started working freelance accounting jobs to generate enough income to cover the payments. Every month, I sent checks to cover the legal fees, audit penalties, and business loans. Every month, I felt the weight of guilt and confusion pressing down on me like a stone. My family gatherings became exercises in public shame, with Lawrence and Cordelia treating me like a criminal who hadn't yet confessed. "We appreciate what you're doing to make this right," Cordelia would say in front of other family members, her voice dripping with false compassion. "It takes courage to face the consequences of your mistakes." But I hadn't made any mistakes. I knew that with absolute certainty, even as everyone around me insisted otherwise. The problem was proving it. I started keeping detailed records of every payment I made, every sacrifice I endured, every humiliation I suffered. If I was going to bear this burden, I wanted documentation of exactly what it cost me. The file grew thick with receipts, bank statements, and copies of checks totaling over $200,000 in penalties and fees. The worst part wasn't the money, it was the isolation. Friends started treating me differently when word spread about the audit. Professional contacts became distant. Even casual acquaintances seemed to look at me with suspicion, as if financial fraud was contagious. I found myself working longer hours, partly to pay the bills and partly to avoid the judgmental looks and whispered conversations. My world had shrunk to my small apartment, my freelance clients, and the monthly ritual of writing checks to cover my supposed crimes. But late at night, when the bills were paid and the apartment was quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was wrong with the whole situation. 2 years into my exile from the family business, I began to notice patterns that didn't make sense. While I struggled to cover the audit penalties and legal fees, Cordelia seemed to be thriving. She'd moved into a luxury apartment in downtown Seattle, started driving a brand new BMW, and had taken several expensive vacations that she documented extensively on social media. "Business consulting is really taking off," she explained when I asked about her obvious prosperity during one awkward family dinner. "I've been helping other accounting firms improve their security and compliance procedures." The irony wasn't lost on me. My sister was building a career on the back of our family's audit disaster, positioning herself as an expert on the very problems that had supposedly been my fault. She spoke at industry conferences about preventing internal fraud and identifying warning signs of employee misconduct. Lawrence beamed with pride when she showed us articles featuring her expertise. "At least something good came out of this mess," he said, carefully not looking at me. "Cordelia's really made a name for herself." I forced myself to smile and offer congratulations, but something twisted in my stomach. While I worked 60-hour weeks to pay for penalties I didn't incur, my sister was profiting from our family's reputation crisis. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving dinner that year. We were gathered around Lawrence's dining room table, the same table where we'd celebrated business successes and family milestones for decades. The conversation turned to Cordelia's latest consulting contract, a prestigious engagement with a major accounting firm in San Francisco. "They specifically requested me because of my experience with audit remediation," Cordelia said, cutting into her turkey with precise movements. "They want someone who understands how these fraud schemes develop and how to prevent them." "Fraud schemes?" I repeated slowly. "Is that what we're calling what happened to our business?" Cordelia looked up, her knife paused mid-cut. "Well, yes. The audit found evidence of deliberate manipulation. That's fraud by definition." "And you think I deliberately manipulated our books to steal from clients?" The table went silent. Lawrence set down his fork and looked between us with the expression of a man tired of refereeing the same fight. "Melody, we've been through this," he said quietly. The evidence was clear. "Can we please just have a peaceful dinner?" But I couldn't let it go. "Cordelia, when you consult with these firms about preventing fraud, do you tell them that the perpetrator in our case was never actually prosecuted? That the supposed criminal was never even formally accused of a crime?" Cordelia's composure cracked slightly. "The lack of criminal charges doesn't mean no crime occurred. Sometimes prosecutors choose not to pursue cases for various reasons. Such as insufficient evidence to meet the criminal standard of proof," she said quickly. "That doesn't mean the behavior was acceptable, or that there weren't consequences." I stared at my sister across the table, studying her face in the candlelight. Something in her tone, in the way she'd answered so quickly and specifically, triggered a memory. During the audit, she'd demonstrated an unusual knowledge of legal standards and prosecution guidelines for financial crimes. At the time, I'd assumed she was just researching to better understand our situation. Now I wondered if there was another explanation. "You seem to know a lot about criminal prosecution standards," I said carefully. "Have you been researching this topic extensively?" Cordelia's hand tightened on her knife. "Of course I have. Our family business was nearly destroyed. I wanted to understand exactly what happened and how to prevent it from happening again." The conversation moved on, but I couldn't stop thinking about her reaction. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I started my investigation the next morning, driven by an intuition I could no longer ignore. If someone had used my login credentials to alter our books, they would have needed detailed knowledge of our systems, access to the office, and familiarity with accounting procedures sophisticated enough to fool an IRS audit. The list of people with that combination of knowledge and opportunity was very short. I contacted our former IT consultant, Trevor Yamamoto, who had helped us set up our computer systems. Over coffee at a downtown cafe, I asked him about security protocols and user access logs. "The thing about your old system," Trevor said, stirring sugar into his latte, is that it kept much more detailed logs than most people realized. Every keystroke, every mouse click, every file access was recorded with timestamps and location data. Location data? IP addresses, machine identifiers, even physical location if the computer had GPS capabilities. The audit team probably only looked at the basic login information, but there would have been much more detailed data available. My heart raced. Would that data still exist? Depends on the backup procedures. Most firms keep archived logs for at least 7 years for compliance purposes. You'd need administrative access to retrieve them, though. I spent the next week researching data recovery and forensic analysis procedures. What I learned was both encouraging and frustrating. The detailed logs Trevor described would indeed show exactly who had made what changes when, but accessing them would require technical expertise I didn't possess. That's when I remembered something important. Before the audit, Cordelia had volunteered to handle our system backups and archive procedures. She'd insisted on taking over that responsibility, claiming she wanted to learn more about the technical side of the business. I drove to the office building where Harrison and Associates had operated. The business had downsized significantly after the audit, but Lawrence still maintained a small office on the second floor. I used my old key code, hoping he hadn't changed it. The office was quiet and dimly lit. Most of our old equipment was gone, but I knew Lawrence kept financial records and backup drives in the fireproof safe behind his desk. If the detailed system logs still existed, they would be there. I found boxes of backup drives dating back 8 years. Each was carefully labeled with dates and system identifiers. My hands shook as I located the drives covering the period when the fraudulent entries had been made. Using a laptop I'd brought, I began searching through archived files. The technical data was overwhelming, thousands of entries showing every interaction with our accounting system. But slowly, patterns began to emerge. The fraudulent entries had indeed been made using my login credentials. But according to the detailed logs Trevor had described, they'd been made from Cordelia's computer, using her IP address, from her physical location in the office. I stared at the screen, hardly believing what I was seeing. The timestamps showed that someone had used my login from Cordelia's workstation during evening hours when I could prove I was elsewhere. More importantly, the logs showed that Cordelia's credentials had been used to access my password file several days before each fraudulent entry. She had stolen my login information, used it to make the alterations, and then covered her tracks by deleting the obvious evidence while preserving plausible deniability. But there was more. Hidden in a folder marked Personal Backup, I found something that made my blood freeze. It was an email draft, never sent, dated 3 days before the audit notice arrived. The subject line read, Contingency Plan, M Investigation. I opened the file with trembling fingers and read the most devastating betrayal of my life. The email was addressed to no one, clearly a draft that Cordelia had written but never intended to send. It was a detailed plan for handling the upcoming audit and ensuring that I would take the blame for her alterations to our books. The changes I made to client accounts should be discovered within the next few weeks, the email began. I've been careful to use Melody's login credentials for every alteration, and I've deleted the obvious traces from the system logs. When the investigation begins, the evidence will point directly to her. I read the words 3 times before their full meaning sank in. My sister had deliberately sabotaged our family business and systematically framed me for her crimes. But it got worse. Melody's personality works in my favor, the email continued. She's always been the responsible one, the one who takes blame even when it's not deserved. She'll accept guilt for these changes, because she can't imagine that her own sister would betray her so completely. The clinical detachment in her tone was almost worse than the betrayal itself. She had studied my character, identified my weaknesses, and exploited them with surgical precision. The key will be maintaining sympathy for her, while supporting Dad's disappointment. I need to appear loyal to family while letting her dig herself deeper into guilt and isolation. The consulting opportunities from this audit scandal should be worth at least $500,000 over the next 3 years. My hands shook as I printed multiple copies of the email. This wasn't just fraud. It was conspiracy, calculated destruction of family bonds for financial gain. Cordelia had stolen money, destroyed our business, and ruined my reputation because she saw an opportunity to profit from our family's crisis. The email ended with a list of potential consulting clients and speaking opportunities that would be available to someone with insider experience in accounting fraud cases. She had planned to build her entire career on the wreckage of our family business and my destroyed reputation. I sat in the empty office, surrounded by the ghosts of our family's success, and felt a cold fury settle in my chest. For 7 years, I had carried guilt that belonged to someone else. I had paid for crimes I didn't commit, endured shame I didn't deserve, and watched my sister profit from my suffering. That ended today. I called Lawrence and Cordelia separately, asking them to meet me at his house that evening for an important family discussion. I told them I had something significant to share about the audit situation, something that might help us finally move forward. Lawrence sounded tired, but hopeful. "Are you ready to tell us what really happened, Melody?" "Yes, Dad," I said quietly. "I'm ready to tell you exactly what happened." Cordelia's response was more cautious. "What kind of information are you talking about?" "Evidence," I said simply. "Documentation that changes everything we thought we knew about the audit." That evening, I arrived at Lawrence's house carrying a briefcase containing printouts of the system logs, copies of Cordelia's email, and a detailed timeline showing exactly how she had executed her fraud. I had also prepared a comprehensive financial analysis showing how my payments over the years had exceeded the actual penalties by more than $50,000. Lawrence was already seated in his office when I arrived. Cordelia came in a few minutes later, looking polished and confident in her business attire. She had no idea that her 7-year conspiracy was about to crumble. "Thank you both for coming," I said, setting my briefcase on Lawrence's desk. "I know this situation has been difficult for all of us, and I wanted to share some information that I think will provide clarity." Cordelia leaned forward slightly. "What kind of information?" I opened the briefcase and pulled out the printed email. "Information about who really altered our accounting records, who actually committed fraud, and who has been lying to this family for 7 years." I handed the email to Lawrence first. As he read, I watched his face change from confusion to shock, to a deep, hurt anger. "Cordelia," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Please explain what this means." I had waited 7 long years for this moment. Now, finally, the truth would set me free. Lawrence's trusted attorney confirmed that Cordelia's email constituted both admission of guilt and conspiracy to commit fraud. Within weeks, federal investigators reopened the case, this time focusing on the right suspect. Cordelia faced criminal charges for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy, ultimately receiving a 3-year prison sentence and permanent revocation of her accounting license. Her consulting business collapsed overnight when clients learned about her criminal conviction, and she was forced to liquidate her luxury lifestyle to pay restitution to the original victims and cover legal fees. Lawrence, devastated by the revelation that he had spent years punishing his innocent daughter while enabling his guilty one, transferred full ownership of the remaining business assets to me and publicly cleared my name in industry publications. Cordelia's carefully constructed reputation as a fraud prevention expert became a source of professional ridicule when the truth emerged, and she found herself unemployable in any financial field. Lawrence struggled with guilt over his favoritism and the years of unjust treatment he had subjected me to, ultimately entering therapy to address his inability to see past Cordelia's manipulations. As I signed the papers making me the sole owner of Harrison and Associates, I reflected on how Cordelia's greatest mistake was underestimating the very sister she had tried to destroy. She had been right about one thing. I was the responsible one. Thorough enough to investigate, persistent enough to uncover the truth, and strong enough to rebuild what she had tried to tear down. And now I knew that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone's own calculated cruelty become the foundation of their complete downfall.